Air India 171. Seconds after Air India Flight 171 lifted off the runway in Ahmedabad, what should have been a routine trip to London turned into a nightmare no one on board or on the ground could have imagined. Just 32 seconds into the flight, the Boeing 7878, carrying 242 souls, lost power and plummeted straight into a medical college hostel barely a mile from the airport. The crash claimed 19 lives on the ground, injured many others, and left behind a scene of devastation that stretched across 5 shattered buildings. The black boxes later revealed a chilling twist. Both of the aircraft's engines lost thrust almost immediately after takeoff because the fuel control switches, critical to keeping the engines alive, were mysteriously moved from run to cut off. It's the aviation equivalent of slamming the brakes in midair. A stunned pilot's voice on the cockpit recording asked why the fuel was shut off, only to be met with a baffled response: did not. In those heart-stopping moments, the switches were flipped back to run, but physics wasn't giving second chances. The jet was already sinking too fast, too low to pull up. And yet, amid the wreckage, one man defied every odds stacked against him. Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, a 40-year-old British passenger in seat 11A, emerged as the sole survivor. His section of the fuselage tore free during impact and came to rest on the ground floor of the hostel. Against all expectations, he walked away with only minor injuries, while 260 others, passenger crew and people on the ground, lost their lives. Investigators are still trying to unravel what caused those fatal switch movements. Was it human error, a mechanical glitch, something more sinister? Until the truth surfaces, the final seconds inside the cockpit remain an unsettling mystery. Light Air Services Beechcraft 1900. On a quiet morning in South Sudan, what began as a routine charter flight for oil workers turned into a disaster that left only one survivor. A 23-year-old Beechcraft 1900D operated by Eagle Air for Light Air Services lifted off from GPOC Unity Airstrip on January 29, 2025, bound for Juba. On board were 21 people. 19 passengers, mostly employees of a Chinese oil consortium, and 2 Ugandan pilots tasked with getting them safely to the capital. Barely 10 minutes into the flight, something went terribly wrong. Witnesses on the ground described the aircraft suddenly losing height before slamming into the terrain near Rupkona County. Some even claimed a wing appeared to snap midair, sending the turboprop spiraling down. When rescuers reached the crash site, the plane laid upside down, debris scattered for hundreds of feet, a grim scene that confirmed the worst. 20 people lost their lives that morning, 2 of them after being rushed to the hospital. Only one man, a South Sudanese engineer, survived, clinging to life as he was airlifted to Bentiu and later transferred to Juba for critical care. His survival story stood out as a single thread of hope in a tragedy that devastated families across South Sudan, China, Uganda, and India. Authorities moved quickly to retrieve the flight recorder, sending it to the United States for analysis. Investigators from New Zealand and Singapore joined the effort, aiming to uncover why a plane with decades of flying experience and a seemingly straightforward flight plan failed so catastrophically. Questions lingered over maintenance practices and the decision to keep aging aircraft in service. Activists pointed fingers at weak enforcement of safety standards, suggesting that this tragedy, priced at a devastating human cost, might have been avoidable. For now, the cause remains under investigation, but the haunting memory of Flight 5X RHB's final moments hangs heavy over Unity State. Saria Airlines Bombardier CRJ-200. On the morning of July 24, 2024, Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu witnessed one of Nepal's deadliest aviation disasters. A Bombardier CRJ-200LR, operated by Saria Airlines, was scheduled to make a short ferry flight to Pokhara for a maintenance check. 19 people were on board, 3 crew members and 16 passengers, most of them Saria employees and technicians. Among them was a young child, a wife accompanying her husband, and a flight crew with years of experience. What unfolded within minutes of takeoff left families shattered and the country demanding answers. The aircraft began its takeoff roll just after 11:10 a.m. local time. Moments later, it veered sharply, banking first to the right, then violently to the left before losing altitude. Witnesses reported cracking noises seconds before the right wing clipped the ground. The plane tore apart, sliding into a 130-foot gorge beside the runway before erupting into flames. Out of 19 on board, 18 lost their lives, some dying later in the hospital. The captain survived but suffered broken bones, head injuries, and burns after the cockpit separated and lodged into a freight container. Investigators later revealed a chain of alarming errors. The crew had used faulty takeoff speed data, causing them to rotate too soon and pitch the aircraft upward at an excessive rate, triggering a deep stall that left no chance of recovery at such a low altitude. Cargo was poorly loaded, unsecured, and overweight for the calculated speeds. The airline's own manuals had been violated, and previous incidents of risky takeoffs had gone unaddressed. The aftermath was chaos. Airports shut down, grounded flights, and political figures crowding the crash site while rescue crews worked desperately. A 5-member commission launched a probe, and both black boxes were sent to Singapore for analysis. The final report called the tragedy avoidable, a devastating example of negligence, faulty procedures, and overlooked warning signs that ended with 18 lives and an airline's reputation reduced to ashes. Saha Airlines Boeing 707. On January 14, 2019, a 42-year-old Boeing 707 cargo plane operated by Saha Airlines took off from Manas International Airport in Kyrgyzstan, loaded with a shipment of meat bound for Iran. 16 crew members were on board as the aircraft descended toward its planned destination, Payam International Airport. But in a catastrophic mistake, the crew lined up with the wrong runway, a shorter strip at Fath Air Base, barely 4,300 feet long, far less than the 8,200 feet the Boeing 707 needed to stop safely. The touchdown was rough, the speed unforgiving. The aircraft barreled down the too short runway, plowed through a wall, and smashed into an empty house before erupting into flames. 15 lives were lost instantly, leaving only one survivor, a man who would become the lone voice of a tragedy that could have claimed all 16. That survivor was Farshad Madavanijad, the flight engineer. He was pulled from the wreckage in critical condition, suffering severe injuries but clinging to life as rescuers rushed him to Shariati Hospital. Every breath he took that day defied the odds stacked against him. A burning fuselage, the twisted wreck of a 42-year-old jet, and the loss of his entire crew family around him. Security cameras had caught the final moments of the doomed landing, showing the jet bursting through barriers, leaving only destruction in its wake. But they did not capture the sheer resilience it took for Farshad to make it out alive. His survival became the rare thread of hope in a story otherwise marked by fire, steel, and silence. Investigators later recovered the black boxes, hoping to piece together why an experienced crew mistook one runway for another. But for Farshad, the haunting memory of that January morning would never need a report to remind him. He had lived the final seconds of a disaster no one else on board survived. Cubana de Aviation Flight 0972. On May 18, 2018, Cubana de Aviation Flight 0972 lifted off from Havana's Jose Marti International Airport under clear skies, bound for Holguin. It was supposed to be a routine domestic flight, but just minutes later, a 39-year-old Boeing 737-201 plunged into the ground, leaving only one person alive among the 113 on board. That survivor was a 19-year-old Cuban woman whose name would later become a symbol of resilience, but her survival came at a devastating cost. Moments after takeoff, witnesses on the ground noticed something wrong. The aircraft banked awkwardly. One engine appeared to struggle, and then, within seconds, it plummeted into a nearby farm, tearing through train tracks before bursting into flames. First responders rushed in, pulling 4 people alive from the wreckage. Over the next week, 3 of them died from their injuries, leaving just one survivor fighting for life against unimaginable odds. Her injuries were catastrophic: severe burns, spinal damage that left her paralyzed from the waist down, a shattered body that required amputation of her left leg. She endured countless surgeries and months in a hospital bed. For nearly a year, she was trapped in a cycle of pain, survival, and recovery, before finally being released in March 2019. Yet, even as she clung to life, questions swirled about why this flight went so wrong. Investigators later revealed a chain of fatal errors: incorrect weight calculations, a misjudged center of gravity, and poor handling during takeoff. The aircraft had been overloaded by more than 5,000 pounds, and the pilots climbed too steeply, dooming the flight before it even cleared Havana's outskirts. This lone survivor carried the burden of 112 lost lives, a human reminder of how one flight, one mistake, and one tragic moment in the sky changed everything forever. Algerian Air Force C-130. On February 11, 2014, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules military transport plane cut through a stormy Algerian sky on its way to Constantine. On board were 78 people, soldiers and their families heading home. But as the aircraft neared the mountainous terrain of Jebel Fertes, disaster struck. Heavy snow, fierce winds topping 30 miles per hour, and almost zero visibility created a deadly trap. Moments later, the plane slammed into the mountainside, leaving behind twisted wreckage and a trail of tragedy that would rock Algeria. 77 lives were lost that day, leaving just one man breathing among the devastation. The lone survivor, a soldier, was pulled from the wreckage alive. battered and broken, his body marked by head trauma and injuries that left doctors unsure if he'd make it. He was rushed to a military hospital in Constantine, where his fight for life became a silent vigil for the families who'd lost everything. 76 bodies were eventually recovered from the crash site, while the survivor's condition remained critical. His survival seemed less like luck and more like a cruel twist of fate, as he woke to a reality where dozens of his fellow passengers, friends, comrades, and even children had perished within feet of where he sat. The aircraft itself was a US-built C-130, part of Algeria's fleet since the 1980s, a workhorse trusted for decades. But that day, trust met tragedy when nature overwhelmed man and machine. Investigators pieced together a grim picture: a storm system rolling over northern Algeria, snow hammering the higher elevations, and a pilot fighting blind against terrain he couldn't see until it was too late. The soldier's survival turned him into a living reminder of one of Algeria's deadliest air disasters, a moment frozen in time where 77 souls were lost, and only one soldier lived to carry their memory forward. Yemenia Flight 626. The final chapter of Yemenia Flight 626's tragic story began when it stalled and plunged into the Indian Ocean in the early hours of June 30th, 2009. The aging Airbus A310 had been ferrying passengers from Paris with a layover in Yemen before its final leg to the Comoros Islands. A French official later claimed the aircraft had been previously banned from French territory for technical faults, a shocking detail that only added to the brewing controversy. A brutal cold front had brought high winds to the area, creating conditions that were anything but ideal for the pilots. A 44-year-old captain and his 50-year-old first officer, both of whom had flown to the destination many times before. What ultimately brought the plane down, however, was a series of critical mistakes. The final investigation concluded that the crew's uncoordinated and inappropriate flight inputs caused the plane to stall, and they failed to react to the numerous warnings blaring in the cockpit. Amidst the chaos and stress, the crew's focus wavered, and a fatal lack of training and proper briefing before the flight sealed the fate of everyone on board. The wreckage and the 152 victims were scattered across the open ocean, but a single incredible miracle emerged from the debris. 12-year-old Bahia Bakari was found clinging to a piece of floating wreckage after an astonishing 13 hours alone in the water. Bakari, who was traveling with her mother and had a limited ability to swim, was picked up by local fishermen and speedboats. She was later flown to a Paris hospital, where she recovered from her harrowing ordeal. This young girl's improbable survival was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise devastating tragedy. Sudan Airways Flight 139. In the early hours of July 8, 2003, Sudan Airways Flight 139 lifted off from Port Sudan with 117 souls on board. It was supposed to be a routine domestic flight from Khartoum, but just 15 minutes after takeoff, trouble struck. One of the Boeing 737's engines failed, leaving the pilots scrambling to bring the plane back to safety. What followed was a desperate attempt to land that ended in tragedy. The aircraft missed the runway, crashed to the ground, and exploded into flames. Out of everyone on board, only a 2-year-old boy survived. The wreckage painted a horrifying picture: 116 lives lost in an instant, families torn apart, and a Boeing 737 reduced to scattered debris on the Sudanese desert floor. The child, thrown clear of the worst of the impact, was pulled from the burning remains by rescuers who could barely believe their eyes. Covered in burns and injuries, his survival seemed like an act of defiance against the sheer brutality of the crash. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, doctors fighting for every breath he took while the nation mourned the devastating loss. Officials later revealed that years of U.S. sanctions had left Sudan Airways struggling to source essential spare parts. The 28-year-old aircraft named White Nile hadn't received the proper maintenance it desperately needed. That chain of neglect may have set the stage for disaster. The 2-year-old boy became the face of this catastrophe, a lone witness to a tragedy born of mechanical failure, human error, and systemic neglect. Today, the crash of Flight 139 remains Sudan's deadliest aviation accident. The story of its sole survivor, a tiny child pulled from a field of fire and twisted metal, is a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be when every safeguard meant to protect it fails at once. Air Algerie Flight 6289. It was March 6, 2003, and the Air Algerie Boeing 737 was set to fly from Tamarasset to Algiers, a routine domestic flight that carried 97 passengers and 6 crew members. The flight was popular with people heading to the capital, and many on board were dual Algerian French citizens. In a cruel twist of fate, the passengers included 14 members of the Mouloudia de Adrien football team, who were en route to a regional qualifying match. As the 19-year-old plane named Mountains of Daya hurtled down the runway, its destination and the passengers' hopes were tragically ripped away. An explosion rocked one of the engines, and the aircraft began to sway uncontrollably. On the flight deck, the pilot flying, a 44-year-old first officer calmly reported a small problem. But in the critical moments that followed, the 48-year-old captain, who had been chatting with the flight attendant before takeoff, took over the controls. He maintained an excessive pitch angle and failed to retract the landing gear, a crucial step for a single-engine takeoff. The plane, which was already heavy and operating in the thin, hot air of the desert, lost airspeed and stalled. It crashed into a field just 2 minutes after liftoff, instantly claiming the lives of 102 people. Yet, from the devastation, a single survivor emerged. Youssef Jilali, a 28-year-old Algerian soldier, was found in a coma with severe injuries. He had been seated in the last row of the plane and, miraculously, was ejected from the wreckage upon impact. Doctors said his injuries were not life-threatening, and he regained consciousness the very next day. He was the sole individual to defy the odds, escaping a crash that claimed so many lives.